This is Michael writing, and I'll be telling you the story about the freedom riders who risked their lives to try to bring fairness to the black people of the civil rights revolution that took place in the 1950s and 1960s. And yes, that's a children's book, because this is a story, so I hope you enjoy. The Freedom Riders were created to test the court decision on the Borton versus Virginia case, which was to convict a black man while being in a restaurant, as back then there were restaurants where only white people could eat and black restaurants where only black people could eat. And when they crossed the boundaries, well, that didn't set well with the government. The first Freedom Ride began on May 4th, 1961, led by Corps Director James Farmer, showed here. 13 riders, 7 were black and 6 were white, left Washington, D.C. Now, what are Freedom Riders, you ask? They were the combinations of protesters on buses, basically riding around on buses protesting for civil rights and equality among whites and blacks. Their travel plan was to drive through Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, ending with a rally in New Orleans, Louisiana, site of the recent Hurricane Katrina that occurred in 2005. Most of the riders were from the Corporation, and 2 of the riders were from NCC. Most of the riders were in their 40s and 50s, although some of them were probably college students, not the ones shown here protesting for Vietnam, that followed in the Freedom Rides afterwards. The Freedom Rider plan was to ride around the cities, protest their views while on the bus, avoid the cops so they don't get arrested, and move on to the next city until they get to New Orleans. The Freedom Riders overall had a good run, only having minor difficulties in Virginia and South Carolina. 2 arrests did occur in North Carolina and South Carolina. Not saying that the 2 arrested pictures shown here were arrested in those states. Despite the 2 arrests, the riders were doing a pretty good job. However, they would have some trouble coming up in their next state they were driving in. Birmingham was the next city that the riders arrived in. But Tom Cook and Bill Connor, 2 police chiefs, has set up a plan to stop the Freedom Riders in this town. However, they allowed additional mobs to attack the Freedom Riders for 15 minutes before arrests being made. Their final plan was to have an assault in Anniston, Alabama, and finally taking place in Birmingham, shown in the previous slide. In Anniston, a mob attacked the Greyhound bus and slashed its tires. When the crippled bus had to stop several miles out of town, it was firebombed by the mob, causing it in cars. As the bus burned, the mob held the doors shut, intent on burning the riders to death. Exploding fuel tank caused the mob to retreat, allowing the riders to escape from the bus. The riders were viciously beaten as they led burnings. Only warning shots were fired in the air to prevent riders from being severely hurt. And note, this is not in the town of Anniston. This is in a different location. Many Freedom Riders from the attacks of Birmingham and Anniston, Alabama, were housed in hospitals like these. However, they were kicked out early because fears of the mob attacking the hospitals were becoming evident. Nashville student and SNCC leader Diane Nash felt that if violence were allowed to halt the Freedom Riders, the movement would be set back years. She pushed to find replacements to resume the ride, and on May 17th, a new set of riders, 10 students from Nashville, took a bus to Birmingham, where they were arrested by Bill Connor and jailed. These students kept their spirits up in jail by singing freedom songs out of frustration. Connor drove them back to Tennessee and dropped them off because he just couldn't stand that singing. The Freedom Riders, who would answer SNCC's call from across the eastern U.S., joined John Lewis, shown here, who I shown earlier as an arrest photo, and Hank Thomas, the two young SNCC members of the original ride, who had remained in Birmingham. On May 19th, they attempted to resume the ride, but were terrified by the howling mob surrounding the bus depot. The drivers refused. Harassed and beset by the KKK mob, the riders waited all night for a bus. Under intense public pressure from the Kennedy administration, Greyhound was forced to provide a driver, and Alabama Governor John Pasterson reluctantly promised to protect the bus from KK mobs and snipers on the road between Birmingham and Montgomery. After direct intervention from Attorney General's office employee Baron White, on the morning of May 20th, the Freedom Riders resumed, with the bus carrying the riders traveling toward Montgomery at 90 miles an hour, protected by the contingents of the Alabama State Highway Patrol. However, when they reached the Montgomery city limits, the Highway Patrol abandoned them, and at the bus station, a huge white mob was waiting and viciously beat the Freedom Riders with baseball bats, iron pipes, mops, or possibly even Legos. The local police allowed the beatings to go on uninterrupted. Again, white Freedom Riders branded, "We signed up for particularly brutal beatings." Reporters and news photographers were also attacked, and their cameras were destroyed. But there is a famous picture taken later of Jim Zerwerg in the hospital, which I am not going to show in this slideshow, beaten and bruised. Justice Department official Cy Scheimer was beaten and left unconscious, lying in the street. This is particularly important, as Sennheiser was a representative of Robert Kennedy. The mob totally disregarded this, which shows the violence was getting out of hand and they were turning into savage monkeys, or more like apes, like Planet of the Apes. Ambulances refused to take the wounded to the hospital. Local blacks rescued them, and a number of the Freedom Riders were hospitalized under the lovely black care. The next day, Monday, May 22nd, more Freedom Riders from Corps and NCC arrived in Montgomery to continue the rides and replace the wounded riders still in the hospital. Behind the scenes, the Kennedy administration agreed a deal with the governors of Alabama and Mississippi. The governors agreed that state police and National Guard would protect the riders from mob violence, thereby ending embarrassing media coverage of bloody lawlessness and broken body parts and stuff like that. And in return for the federal government would not intervene to stop local police from arresting Freedom Riders for violating segregation ordinances when the buses arrived at the depots, even though such arrests violated the Supreme Court's Bonton decision. On Wednesday morning, May 24th, Freedom Riders boarded buses for their journey to Jackson, Mississippi, surrounded by Highway Patrol and National Guard. The buses arrived in Jackson without incident, and the riders were immediately arrested when they tried to use the white-only facilities at the depot. In Montgomery, Freedom Riders, including Yale University, Chapman, William Sterling Coffin, Shuttlesworth, Abercrombie, Wyatt T. Walker, and others were similarly arrested for violating local segregation ordinances. No one knows if the riders made it to New Orleans, but they probably did, and I forgot to research that. But the Freedom Rider spirit continues in John Lewis, who originally was part of the Freedom Riders, is now a House of Representatives, in which he still is today, which shows this current picture, as he is one of the many people in the House and Senate that are making the tough decisions facing this country's economy. As important as he was to the black community, current black president Barack Obama gave a special award to him, which says, "Because of you." So, that is the brave, saddening, and courageous stories of the Freedom Riders during the Civil Rights Movement in the year 1961. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed this digital story.